Hi, and welcome to the 8th video presentation for our Introduction to Comics and Graphic Novels class. This one is about the early career of Alan Moore. As I've said before in class, I think the three superhero movements that are most important to shaping the genre are the superhero explosion following the invention of Superman beginning in 1938 and continuing through the mid-1940s. And then, of course, the last revolution that we talked about in class, which is the revision of the superhero carried out by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko at Marvel Comics in the 1960s. And now the third and final one that we'll talk about in this unit will be Alan Moore's 5-year monumental tenure at DC Comics in the mid-1980s, which includes a number of really important works, including Swamp Thing and Watchmen. Let's talk about Alan Moore's early life, since it has an impact on his later works, and he's as close to a famous author as is alive in comics today. He was born in 1953 in St. Edmund's Hospital in Northampton, England, and he grew up in a poor neighborhood of Northampton called the Burrows. He still lives in Northampton today, and notoriously, he refuses to leave Northampton, whether to live or even to go on vacation. He traveled to a few Comic Cons during his mid-1980s fame, but gave it up. He didn't like to travel, and he thinks that everything he needs is located in Northampton. As a matter of fact, he's so obsessed with Northampton that in 2016, he wrote a well-reviewed fiction novel about the Burrows and about the history of the Burrows called Jerusalem, which is so big it's bigger than War and Peace, and it comes, in some cases, in a 3-book slipcase because it's so large that it's difficult to bind it into a single book. It's pretty amazing. I have not been able to get through the whole thing, but what I have been able to get through is impressive. One of these days, maybe this Christmas, I'll sit down and work my way all the way through Jerusalem. He attends a neighborhood primary school called Spring Lake, and he starts to discover English and American comic books, particularly in the fact that comics are used as ballast in Northampton shipping boxes that come into the port in Northampton. Comic books are, again, not considered to be a fancy medium, and so they're used, comic books that nobody's reading and nobody cares about are used to sort of pad down other goods that are being shipped in crates and boxes into Northampton's port. So he'll hang out at the port, get some free comics, keep reading it, and he discovers English and particularly American comic books that way. In 1964, he is lifted out of Spring Lake and sent to an accelerated school called Northampton Grammar School because of his gift with words, and he struggles with academic success there. He has difficulty getting good grades, and his heart doesn't really seem to be in the school machine at the time. In 1969, at the age of 16, he participates in UK comics fandom by going to the second only British Comic Con ever. He missed the first, he went to the second, and threw himself into being involved in comics, writing about comics, producing fanzines about comics, etc. The year later, his family is displaced from the Burrows, moved out of the Burrows as part of an urban renewal project. Basically, their old home is torn down and they get a new home in a project, the way that we would talk about projects here for low-cost housing for folks. As a matter of fact, Jerusalem is all about the way in which Northampton doesn't understand how important its own history is and how it continually sort of destroys that history and paves over it. He's also kicked out of school, out of the Northampton Accelerated School for dealing LSD. And he becomes a dropout. He begins a series of menial jobs, including janitor, meter reader, etc. Goes for long stretches while being unemployed. And really, his creativity flourishes only when he writes for fanzines and publications that are produced by the Northampton Arts Lab. The Arts Lab was a movement in England at the time to create storefronts where people could go and simply learn to be an artist by getting the supplies that they need. So if you wanted to make a film, you would sign out a camera from the Northampton Arts Lab and you would shoot a film and learn how to edit it. If you wanted to publish something, if you wanted to publish a fanzine, you'd learn how to use the mimeograph machine and begin to publish your own fanzines and publications like Moore did. If you wanted to learn to play a musical instrument, you go there to take music lessons, etc. This was a movement out of the 1970s British counterculture, and it also spawned another really important artist, David Bowie, who was very involved in a London arts lab. In 1971, Moore meets and eventually marries his first wife, Northampton native Phyllis Dixon, and he continues low-level jobs while being interested in comics and comics fandom. In 1974 to 77, he does his first comics work, a comic strip that he both draws and writes called Anony Mouse in the alternative paper of Northampton, one of the weekly newspapers that was spawned by the counterculture that existed both in the US and the UK in the 1970s. And in 1977, he realizes that he loves comics so much, and he loves even drawing and writing Anony Mouse so much that he quits his salary job and takes the risk of working on comics full-time. In 1978, Alan and Phyllis have their first daughter, Leah, who was born on February 4th. And in 1979, he begins writing and drawing other comic strips. One for the New Music Express, which is a national publication about music, a sort of parody of detectives in film noir called Roscoe Moscow. And then for a more regional newspaper, the Northants Post, he does Maxwell the Magic Cat. That's hard to say. And a sample of Maxwell is on here. It's just a kind of throwaway little strip that he both writes and draws. In 1980, Moore's second daughter, Amber, is born. And Moore kind of turns his attention primarily to comic book writing for two reasons. One, he realizes that he's no great shakes as an artist. He's no Charles Schultz, so he's never going to have a hit like Peanuts. But he also realizes that he can write better than he can draw. And he can, if he devotes the time that he was devoting to drawing to writing, he could make more money. And given the fact that they were kind of living on the dole, living on welfare, and he was now a father of two daughters, he really kind of needed to step up and support the family. Phyllis was working jobs, but they were living definitely a low-class, kind of impoverished existence, and Moore wanted to make a little bit more money for his family, so he became primarily a comic book writer. Between 1978 and 1984, he works for a number of different comics publications in Britain. Most famously, he worked for Fleetway's 2000 AD, which spawned the British character that's probably most synonymous with contemporary British comics, Judge Dredd, who you see here on this cover. Moore never wrote any Judge Dredd stories, but he would write science fiction stories, one-off science fiction stories called Future Shocks for 2000 AD that were illustrated by some of the artists who worked in the 2000 AD stable. He also worked for Marvel UK, which repackaged Marvel comics that had been originally published in America and then supplemented them with strips that were produced by British creators. And he in particular, along with the artist Alan Davis, did a really interesting run on a sort of Captain America figure in Britain called, predictably enough, Captain Britain. It's very highly regarded. However, it's the work that he does during this period for a magazine called Warrior, started by a Marvel UK editor who decided to become a publisher himself named Des Skin, that really starts to get Moore's, to make Moore's reputation and provides him with a bridge to working in American comics. Warrior started in 1982 and ran into 85, and it was an anthology of different science fiction and superhero characters. Moore was in it from the beginning, and he wrote two of the serials for Warrior, a serial called Miracle Man, parts of which you read for today, or you'll read for this week as we talk about Moore, and then another character called V for Vendetta. We don't have time to talk about V for Vendetta. You should read the book. It's awesome. And it's had real-life implications in the sense that the mask that this character V wears in order to fight against fascist Britain in the then futuristic late 90s has had real-life impact and influenced insurgent groups like Anonymous and Occupy. But if you enjoyed reading Watchmen, you should definitely read V for Vendetta because it's right up there with Moore's best work. I want to talk about Marvel Man, though, or Miracle Man, because it has a lot more to say about superheroes, and of course that's what we're focusing on with the unit. In order to fully understand where Miracle Man comes from, I have to talk a little bit about Superman and Captain Marvel. Okay, so we had Action Comics come out in 1938, number one, establishing Superman as the first superhero in America and starting a sort of superhero boom that led to a huge trend in comics in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Another publisher, Fawcett, followed suit in 1939 with the first appearance of Captain Marvel in Whiz Comics number 2. Captain Marvel is a boy named Billy Batson who, when he says the word Shazam, turns into a character very, very similar to Superman. And frankly, I think Fawcett designed that character to be very, very similar to Superman. You can see here, for example, that even the cover of Captain Marvel's first appearance, where he's throwing the car, is incredibly similar to Action Comics #1. And they have comparable powers. They're both invulnerable. They both have super strength. They both can fly, etc., etc. A lawsuit was filed by DC against publisher Fawcett because they argued that their copyright was being infringed because Captain Marvel was so similar to Superman. And this lawsuit languished in the courts some, but by 1953, DC won the lawsuit against Fawcett, and Fawcett got out of the business of publishing comics. Before they left, however, they basically said, well, since we're not going to publish any comics, do you want to buy our characters? And DC said, sure. And DC, in that process, bought Captain Marvel. So nowadays, when the Shazam movie comes out or whatever, it's actually DC who owns the character that originally plagiarized one of their characters. This is relevant for our study of Miracle Man and the Miracle Man serialized stories in Warrior, because Captain Marvel was a really popular character in Britain. And so when Captain Marvel and Fawcett were forced out of publication by the DC lawsuit, the publisher who had been publishing Captain Marvel stories looked for a copy of a copy, a British version of Captain Marvel to keep the money coming in and keep publishing. So between 1954 and 1963, a guy named Len Miller published Marvel Man comics. Marvel Man comics being basically a ripoff of Shazam, basically a ripoff of Captain Marvel, who was, according to the courts, a ripoff of Superman. So a copy of a copy that kept the readers reading. Between 1954 and 1963, Len Miller published Marvel Man comics, and you get a sense of what those Marvel Man comics were like in that first chapter of Miracle Man that you read for today, right? A little primitive, about time travel, et cetera, kind of ridiculous, and certainly something that had to be rebooted when it was brought to Warrior Comics in the 1980s. And that's precisely what happened. That is, between 1982 and 1984, in the pages of Warrior, Alan Moore and different collaborators, including Alan Davis and Gary Leach, created these stories about this kind of Captain Marvel ripoff who forgets his word and then finally remembers his word. It's not Shazam in this case, but Kimota, that turns him into a superhero. Between 1985 and 1989, the U.S. publisher Eclipse buys the rights to reprint the Marvel Man stories in Warrior, but Marvel Comics refuses to let them use the name Marvel Man, so they have to change the name to Miracle Man. So the run of Eclipse reprints the Warrior stories and publishes 10 new Miracle Man issues written by Alan Moore and drawn by other collaborators, including Rick Veitch and John Totleben. And then it gets more complicated because Eclipse goes under in the early 1990s, and in 2014, Marvel secures the rights to Marvel Man and republishes the whole series. So there's a lot of different twists and turns here, but the bottom line is that despite these twists and turns, people were reading Warrior in America, including comics publishers, and going, what is this? This is incredible. This is remarkable. What's going on? And then when Eclipse picked up the rights to reprint them, they made a huge impact on 1980s comics readers, despite the fact that it was pretty meager material, just basically a ripoff of Captain Marvel that was being rebooted. Incidentally, Alan Moore was so pissed off at Marvel Comics for not allowing him to continue to call the character Marvel Man when it was reprinted in America that he refused to have his name allowed on the Miracle Man reprintings from 2014. So inside one of these comics, for example, it says Story, the original writer. He refused to have his name on it. He was not going to give Marvel the satisfaction of being able to use his name. And here's an image from the story that you read, but it's in black and white because the original stories were published in Warrior in black and white. But I think one way to understand Miracle Man, and perhaps to understand a lot of Moore's entire career, is to consider the question of what if superheroes existed in the real world. His stories feel more real, more crafted, more edgy than any superhero stories that had come before, because he legitimately thinks pretty deeply about what would happen if these superheroes really did have these powers and how it might upset the balance of power. Whether that balance of power be, Miracle Man suddenly realizing that by saying Kimota, he can be a god over the world world that he now inhabits, or Dr. Manhattan learning to be distant from the rest of human beings and not be concerned with their affairs, and transporting himself to Mars and thus throwing the tensions of the Cold War all out of whack. So whatever it is, this idea of what if superheroes existed in the real world is really, really central to a lot of Moore's superhero stories. In Watchmen, the Dr. Manhattan abandoning Earth is interesting, because it means that the superhero it transcends humanity so much that he wouldn't stick around to see what happens to human beings. That human beings are so far beneath Dr. Manhattan that he doesn't take them seriously, doesn't think about them at all. The way in which the trajectory plays out in Miracle Man is very different. In the Eclipse issues, of course, as you would anticipate from what you've already read, Kid Miracle Man comes back and he completely destroys London and kills millions of people. Miracle Man 15, published by Eclipse in 1987, is probably the most violent comic ever published. This is a double-page spread from it about the carnage that is wrought on London as a result of what they did. So one consequence of superheroes being in the real world is a catastrophe on the scale of, Hiroshima or Auschwitz. I mean, our small paltry world is not ready for beings of such incredible power. The other aspect of this that happens is that the destruction of London convinced Miracle Man and his other superpowered friends, of which I will not spoil since you may read it sometime, decide to basically take over the world. They destroy money. They destroy all the nuclear weapons, they completely change the world, and they build a palace on the ruins of London that basically establishes them as being all-powerful rulers over humanity, and they create a utopia. As a matter of fact, the series continued after that happens in Miracle Man number 16, and at that point, Alan Moore handed it off to another writer, then novice comics writer named Neil Gaiman, and he said to Neil, in this last issue of Miracle Man, we've solved all the world's problems, and now the superheroes are the royal court that establishes all the rules of what's happening in the world from now on. Here's the series. Have fun writing it, mate. And I remember Neil Gaiman sort of saying, "Oh my God, Alan Moore gave it to me, and he's established this utopia. What are we going to do?" So the kind of realism and brutality and savagery and also utopianism that infuses the end of the Miracle Man series kind of shows how realistic and how difficult and edgy Moore's work can be. I think Moore had such a huge impact on the superhero genre because he's an expert rebooter. I think the fact of him taking an old moribund copy of Captain Marvel named Marvel Man and turning him into Miracle Man and really crafting the kind of excellent stories that he did in Warrior and the Eclipse issues in the 1980s really established him in the eyes of publishers, someone who could take a character who is kind of nothing and really do something interesting with them. And that is certainly what he would do in American comics as well. The Saga of the Swamp Thing, for example, was DC's poorest selling comics when Moore took it over in 1983. The DC editorial office saw what Moore was doing in Warrior, said, "We got to hire this guy." But since he was a novice, since he was the new kid on the block, he got the lowest selling title. And they said, "Do what you want, it doesn't matter." And he did what he wanted. And he completely rewrote the character from being a human being who's turned into a plant monster into a plant monster who thinks he's a human being. And of course, the anatomy lesson, which you're reading for this week, is a good example of the kind of horrific, kind of brutal stories that are told in the context of Swamp Thing. It's a hell of a series that he does. Moore writes it for just about his whole tenure at DC. It's 40 issues, and it's a really impressive achievement of taking a character that's, considered to be a nothing character, a third-rate character, publisher, and turning it into an artistic and commercial triumph. Moore's success with Swamp Thing at DC means that he gets a crack at doing DC mainstays as well. Many of you have mentioned, for example, of reading The Killing Joke, which is drawn by Brian Bolland and done near the end of Moore's tenure at DC in 1988. It does really rewrite the origin of the Joker and draws interesting and disturbing parallels between the psychopathology of the Joker and Batman's own psychic scars. I won't spoil it again for anybody who hasn't read it, but I personally see it as being an interesting story, but less interesting to me than the ones that Moore creates out of whole cloth. But again, your mileage may differ. If I had to pick one story that Moore did at DC that really does interesting things with the DC characters, my choice probably wouldn't be The Killing Joke. It would be Superman Annual number 11, which is called For the Man Who Has Everything, a story about Superman's friends, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, coming to visit Superman at the Fortress of Solitude for his birthday, only to discover that a supervillain has placed this strange alien parasite on Superman, which basically, the way this parasite works is it influences you so that you dream about a different world that you could live in, a kind of utopia that you could live in, and it puts you into a coma so that you're completely comatose and of no threat. And his friends have to help Superman get out of that coma. And the coma is what if Krypton had survived. And he dreams about whether or not, he would have been happier if Krypton had survived, if he didn't have the responsibilities of being Superman. And it really is one of the best Superman stories ever written. It's been adapted actually into an animated series. There's a Supergirl episode that's based on it. It is considered to be one of the top-notch Superman stories, and it also shows Alan Moore working, not for the first time, but pretty close to the first time, with Dave Gibbons, who would go on to be his illustrator for Watchmen. It's kind of intimidating to talk about Moore's work because Moore's work at DC between 1983 and 1988, which includes Watchmen, which we'll talk about in class this week, is kind of overwhelming. I mean, just those 5 years of our explosion of creativity that tends to overwhelm. But after that, there's thousands and thousands of more pages of Alan Moore to read. He starts his own printing company for a while called Mad Love. He works for Image Comics for a little while. He works for Rob Liefeld's imprinted Image. He works for more alternative publishers like Top Shelf. He does The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He does From Hell, which is maybe his very best work. It's not a superhero story, but it's a great story about Jack the Ripper. He does The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He does his most recent has been he's dove very deep into the worlds of H.P. Lovecraft and done a number of series, The Courtyard, Neonomicon, and particularly Providence, that I think rank with his very best works. It's not up to date, but a good place to start with reading Alan Moore's work is on the Tor.com website. You can see a screen grab here where a really nuanced critic named Tim Callahan did something back in 2011 to 2013 called The Great Alan Moore Reread, where he reads everything that Moore did from the beginning of his career, including from Warrior, Marvel Man, Miracle Man, etc., into the present. And it misses a lot of key works. It misses the last arc of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It misses Providence, but it's a good place to start. And the article also ends with the top 10 Alan Moore comics ever produced. Watchmen is number 2, so I'm going to tell you that you'll have to go to the website to see what Callahan considers to be the best Alan Moore comic of all time. But now we're at DC at 1985. Alan Moore is triumphant with Swamp Thing with his collaborators Steve Bissette and John Totleben. He's also written what is considered to be one of the great Superman stories, For the Man Who Has Everything, and he has an idea to reboot some other characters at DC, and that idea mutates into Watchmen, and we'll talk about that in class. See ya.